Now, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is promising no physical checks along the Irish border after Brexit. He's stepping up his commitment to eliminate the backstop, a plan agreed by his predecessor and the EU as part of the withdrawal agreement. Mr Johnson is in Northern Ireland for talks with the country's political parties as tensions build around upcoming Brexit negotiations, focusing on the UK's border with Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party, which has backed the Prime Minister's hardline on the backstop. And the party also props up his Conservative government in the House of Commons. Well, speaking earlier, DUP leader Arlene Foster explained her support for Mr Johnson's criticism of the backstop.
We very much hope that our new Prime Minister will deal with the issue. He will get across to those in Europe, and particularly in Dublin, the fact that they cannot break up the United Kingdom, because essentially that's what the backstop was doing. It was breaking Northern Ireland away, both in economic terms and indeed in constitutional terms, which of course runs completely contrary to the Belfast Agreement and the principle of consent, which says that for as long as the people of Northern Ireland wish to remain within the United Kingdom, they should do so. And the backstop was running a coach and horses through that, and therefore it is very important that the backstop goes.
And I'm joined now in the studio by the man who knows all about Brexit, and that's our political editor, Darren McCaffrey. So we've heard hard talk there, haven't we, from Arlene Foster and Boris Johnson. How do you think this is going to go down in Dublin?
Well, I think in many regards, it's not going to go terribly well, but that is not to say that this is not what they're used to. Clearly, Boris Johnson has been campaigning against this Irish backstop, which is there in essence to try and avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland for quite some time. And I think Dublin are slightly frustrated with that. They feel that Boris is not properly engaged, and that the suggestion that somehow essentially a hard border can be avoided without the backstop with these kind of technological arrangements, Dublin and Brussels, it must be said, have reiterated that that simply isn't there. Those solutions, at least when it comes to technology, is still a decade away, hence the need for the backstop. But ultimately, all in all, is Boris Johnson having to try and keep the DUP on side, because of course they're propping up the governments in London, but at the same time very concerned, and also it must be said his predecessor Theresa May was as well, about the prospect that if there was a hard border, if there was a crash out of the EU, what would that do for Northern Ireland's place within the UK?
But this issue of the backstop, Darren, is almost becoming a multi-dimensional headache for Boris, because Congress in the US has now waded in, and is that it could potentially block any future US-UK trade deal if peace in Northern Ireland was in any way jeopardised.
Well, yeah, really interesting this. So obviously a lot has been made of Donald Trump and his big suggestion that the UK, when it leaves the EU, could try and the best trade deal in the world when it leaves with Boris Johnson. And he clearly is a big fan of the new British Prime Minister. But what is also interesting is the Irish have been rallying diplomatically their side. It must be said, actually, they're quite successful in Brussels in campaigning to keep the Irish border at the centre of these Brexit negotiations. And now what they've done is they've used the Irish-American community, of which there's quite a lot in the United States, to rally them on side. Nancy Pelosi, the head of the House of Representatives, has made it very clear that if it comes to it, if there is a trade deal, ultimately the president can sign it, but it needs to get confirmation from Congress, and that if they feel that it is going to impede the peace process in Northern Ireland, they are willing to block it.
OK, now very briefly now, Darren, probably even in a sentence, this is the third stop of Boris Johnson's tour. So he's been to Scotland, Wales, now Northern Ireland. How successful do you think it's been? Well,
he got booed in Scotland. We're talking about civil unrest in Wales, and we've seen protests in Northern Ireland. I think it is a constant reminder that as the UK tries to wrench itself away from the European Union, one political union, it is imperiling its own union, because the United Kingdom is made up of 4 different constituent nation states, 2 of whom voted to remain. And what we're seeing is them expressing their concern about the union they're currently in, and that could potentially cause an awful lot of trouble for the UK a little bit further down the line.
OK, Darren McCaffrey, thanks so much for your analysis.